Yeah, I'm Nirupa and I'm a botanical illustrator. So essentially, that means I paint plants, usually with watercolors. And so the book that I've just brought out is called Hidden Kingdom, and it's about what I call the fantastical plants of the Western Ghats. So essentially, it's a combination of some very familiar species like pepper, of some species from the ficus family, fig family, like peepal and banyan, but also some, quite bizarre looking plants that where most of us are not familiar with, like carnivores and parasites, which are nonetheless native to the Western Ghats and can be found just a few hours outside Bangalore at the most. Um, so yeah, some my motivations for doing this. Well, so a few years ago, I came across this quote by a British science writer called George Monbiot, and he was lamenting the fact that year upon year we seem to be growing further and further away from nature, and he wondered if a generation that was disconnected from nature would bother to fight and save it when we needed it the most. And that's something that really struck me because I realized that I sort of took for granted my childhood that was spent road tripping through the Western Ghats with my parents, and I realized that those experiences are what shaped me as an adult to, to care for the environment. And I was working interning in a publishing house called Bloomsbury in London in the children's department, and they had all of these fabulous books that were they had one that was in collaboration with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, RSPB, that was on British birds, and then they had another one on animals in collaboration with the London Zoological Society. And I just wish that I had had something like that that taught me about where I lived. So yeah, this book is kind of an attempt to change that, and since I didn't have it back then, I wanted to do it even for adults, so anyone can enjoy it of any age group. Yeah.
I'm particularly envious because I can't draw. I'm just wondering how many of you, I mean, you can see some of the fabulous illustrations. How many of you can draw at all? I had to do zoology in college and I still have nightmares getting up, about trying to find somebody to draw my monkey or squirrel because it wouldn't look like one. But so these are, I mean, I think one of the things that you got at the core is we lack good nature books about Indian surroundings. All the good nature writing that we really have, most of it is outside, except for a few. I mean, if you look at some of the old classic writers like M. Krishnan, for instance, you had beautiful books on nature that you could really, or Salim Ali's books on, for instance, looking at something as simple as a sparrow outside. So can we recreate that kind of imagination and that kind of love and passion for looking at surroundings around us? And with that, I think I'll move to Sridhar's book.
So very nice to be here, and like Harini said, um, my attempts at nature writing have been to try and convey a better appreciation for nature and about trees. Over the last 3 decades, much of my working life has been spent among trees in the forests of the Western Ghats, where I live and work, or in the Andaman Islands, or in northeastern India, in states like Arunachal Pradesh and Mizoram, and or even in cities like Bangalore or in the Indian countryside. Trees are there everywhere, and I've spent a lot of my time thinking about trees, studying trees, and trying to write about trees. And this I've tried, and it has given me at least three different perspectives. Uh, when we look at trees, we can look at trees as a naturalist, as a scientist or ecologist, or as a writer. And I've tried to bring those three perspectives in some of the essays that are in this book, The Wild Heart of India. And I'll talk a little bit more about that maybe later. Yeah. But very happy to be here today.
Thanks. And I think you got at a crux of something that motivates all of us, that there's so much to marvel at when you look at trees and plants. It's the science that brings us here and helps us understand this, but there's so much beyond the science. If I can loosely put it, it's the magic. And it's the magic of various kinds that we see in this that also we try and bring out. I mean, through these illustrations or through Sridhar's previous book also with Divya, which is also on the magnificent pillars of the Western Ghats, which is on a set of amazing trees off the Western Ghats landscape where he and Divya work for a long time. My journey has been a bit different because I worked on forested landscapes for a long time, but largely through satellite pictures, so seeing the landscape from above. But being from Bangalore, I decided to start looking and working on the city where I live. And started doing that in about 2006. And so this, I mean, I don't think you can see it very clearly, but this is my first book, Nature in the City, which is an ecological history of Bangalore from about 600 AD onwards. And when I wrote that, I wanted a crossover book. I wanted a book which was the science and could speak to researchers and academics. But I also, so it's footnoted and with references and all of that, but I also wanted a book that people could read, regular people living in Bangalore. And along the way, I found that there were a number of people who said they would have liked to read the book, who read it, audiences that I didn't expect to read it, but also audiences that said they would have liked to read the book if it was more accessible. So really from that journey came the second book, which is The Cities and Canopies, which came out earlier this year with another colleague, Seema. And we've been talking about this for a long time, and we thought, let's write a book that shows people the different ways in which we engage with trees, which is sensory, for instance. How does it feel to climb a tree or touch a tree? How does it feel to play games with the seeds of the tree or put the gulmohar sepals on your hands and play with the fingernails, the red fingernails that we all did as kids? How is it to cook with trees? So we have a lot of recipes in the book. What are the riddles around trees that we grew up with? So it's got the science. It's got how do you live with trees and what are the science of trees? How do trees communicate, for instance, an entire chapter on that. But it's got much more than the science. And I think that's, to me, when we say the secret lives of trees, it's that there's so much more mystery that there is in here and that conveys that sense of awe and intrigue and our own passion for trees that we'd like to come up with. So,
so I mean, that's actually coming to this picture, which is from the book. It's funny that you should say this because I think that this picture is pretty atypical if you look at the composition of it. So you have the lion-tailed macaques, which are these primates endemic to the Western Ghats, actually incredible species. But I've just sort of turned things on its head by having the plants, which are a species of wild nutmeg, which is also native to the area, and have them in the foreground just for a change. Because if you ask anyone to name their top 5 favorite animals, they'll definitely be able to do it. But the likelihood of them being able to name like a handful of plants is far lower. So that's something I was attempting to do with this.
So the other thing I find very interesting about trees and plants is the kind of long-lived spectrum of life they come with. And that's why I like your foregrounding of this, because if you think of some of these and their vegetative propagation, it might not be the same plant, but it's the same sort of genetic structure that stayed. There's a banyan tree near my house, and I live on Sarjapur Road, but there's a banyan tree which is amazing on the road between Sarjapur and Attibele, and the local communities say that it's between 300 and 400 years old. So if you think of it, that tree has seen Hyder Ali, it has seen the Wadayas before Hyder Ali, then it's seen Tipu Sultan, it's seen the British. What tales it could tell us if it was there. And that sort of, getting that sense of history, I think, of a landscape through the tree. I know you speak a lot about that, so.
Yeah, in fact, in the previous book that you mentioned, Pillars of Life, which is on the trees of the Western Ghats, Divya and I actually inscribed it, dedicated it to trees because thinking of them as historians of the landscape. Many of these large old trees that you see, whether it's in a village or in a forest, actually encapsulate maybe decades to centuries of history, local history in the tree itself, and its presence tells you so much. And as a scientist, you can even learn even more about the ecological history of the landscape, even from a single tree. So that's something to keep in mind when we look at some of these amazing trees.
Right. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about one thing we're always curious, and I find very interesting after writing the book, is to see how people engage with the book. And I find that people engage with it, just for instance, Cities and Canopies, what we found is a huge section of kids from 10 to 15 years reading with the book, engaging with it and saying things like, you're absolutely right, this brings me back to nostalgic memories of my childhood, and things like, I've seen this change in my lifetime. And then you realize, they have a lifetime, which is 10, 15 years, and they've seen a lot of changes, which is in some sense very scary, because if you're thinking of changes seen over 50, 70 years, and you're having a 15-year-old saying, I've seen changes in my lifetime. So these to us are very, to me, I've been very struck by how people perceive the book. So could you share a bit about the interactions you've had with readers?
So my book has just come out, like literally last week, but it's been the kind of the age group of people that have appreciated this book has been really broad. Like I had someone call me who was I don't know him personally, and I'm not sure how he got my number, but he must have been fairly old, judging by his voice. And he said he'd worked in the forest department, and someone had given him this book as a present. And he said how it just brought back so many memories, and yeah, it was really special to hear that. And there's a sort of whimsy that we've tried to incorporate. I'll show you what I mean. We've got like two different species two different flowers here, and I think the one, okay, I'm not going to go with left or right because I don't know how it looks there, but the blue one is called a bladderwort, and the other one, the pretty weird looking one, is called a ceropegia. And if you had to guess, which one would you say was a carnivore? The ceropegia, right? But it's not, even despite the fact that it looks this crazy. The blue one, actually, the bladderwort, it lives in areas where of very high rainfall, where the nutrient content in the soil is poor. So it supplements its diet by ingesting organisms from puddles in surrounding areas. But the ceropegia, on the other hand, it does trap flies temporarily, only to ensure that the pollen gets stuck to its back, and then after that it'll open up and let the fly go on again. So never judge a book by its cover, right?
Absolutely, that's fast. Even with Cities and Canopies, we had, as I said, I mean, I can't draw at all, but we had this great artist, Alisha Dutt Islam, who did these amazing sketches, black and white sketches for the book. In fact, I have postcards here, by the way. So if anyone wants to come and pick up a postcard of some of the sketches, the way she was able to illustrate some of the ideas. For instance, the idea of a Jambudvipa. You have the jamun tree, and this is on this mythical island where the jamun fruits as big as elephants drop down and stain the rivers and turn them purple with the juice. Now, couldn't have colored images, but the whole idea, the way she's got this jamun dropping down, you almost feel like jumping in and tasting that fruit. And to get that level of, I think there's something about a sketch or a painting which a photograph doesn't do, because it leaves nothing to the imagination. If you have a photograph, you can't paint in and fill in the details. It's sort of too straightforward in a way. So I think this is a really amazing thing. I mean, I really urge you to go out and look at this. And Nirupa, by the way, also did the sketches for Pillars of Life. So that's something else you should know, because those sketches also, I mean, I think there were some of leaves turning different shades from red to yellow, which to me were particularly striking because it gives you a sense of seasonality. We tend to think of the fact that you need to go to Canada to see trees, going through the fall season. But you don't. There's spectacular trees in the Western Ghats, and this is part of the whole thing of learning about our natural history here. But with this, I'd like to return to one more thing. Sridhar, you were saying that you wanted to, that the three different perspectives of looking at trees. What did you mean by that? Can you tell us a bit more?
Well, it basically stems from my own experience. I started off as a naturalist, looking at trees, and maybe the best way to explain it is to be very particular. Let's imagine a particular tree, let's say a silk cotton tree, and let's say this tree is in Dampa Tiger Reserve in Mizoram. It's close to the Bangladesh border. So you have this ugly border fence that cuts the forest in two pieces. The other side is Bangladesh, this side is India. The tree is in India. And how does a naturalist look at a tree? Being a naturalist trains you to pay attention. And you look at how the tree rises above other trees. You see how it has compound leaves, how the leaves are green, but when they mature, they turn yellow. And then they shed all the leaves in winter, in the Kartika month. And then at the same time, the tree bursts into bloom, scarlet blooms, which are visited by birds and bees and monkeys and squirrels. And as a naturalist, learning to pay attention, it sort of transforms you. A forest that was earlier an undifferentiated mass of green suddenly becomes hundreds of very particular, unique species and individuals. So that's something that struck me. But then, when I was trained as a scientist, when I went to study trees, you start to look at them differently. You measure their height and girth, and you ask questions like, why is this tree flowering when it has no leaves? And it's to attract all the birds and animals that come to the flowers. And they don't just come there to take the nectar. The tree dusts them with pollen so that when they visit the next flower, the tree gets pollinated. And you start seeing that trees are not isolated, immobile, unconnected individuals in the forest. They are actually extremely mobile. They're extremely lively beings that are connected with thousands of other creatures in the forest over very large landscapes. But what I found most challenging was to look at trees as a writer, because there's so many other dimensions, as Harini mentioned, that are not really captured entirely as in natural history and science. You have ethical, you have aesthetic, you have emotional, psychological, so many intangibles linked to trees. And how do you encapsulate that in words? And Nirupa does that so beautifully with her artwork, both in Pillars of Life and in this book. Harini has done it extremely well in drawing the connections between people and trees in her books. And to me, it was always a challenge when I stand there under a tree and I see it brimming with life, with all these birds calling. The tree seems to have a voice of its own, what the writer David George Haskell calls the songs of trees. So how do you catch that voice of the tree? Or you see a row of bamboo stakes going up that tree, and you know that there is a tribal who has climbed that tree to get honey from a rock bee hive that was way up on the branches. You begin to see the tree through somebody else's eyes. Or, you could ask, where does this tree come from? Maybe in the 1960s, there was a tree in Bangladesh where when it bloomed and the pod burst, the seeds came flying, and one seed came to India and grew to be the tree that you are seeing today. So would you tell the tree that you didn't tell me that your parents were Bangladeshi, so I'll cancel your citizenship? Or call the Forest Survey of India and tell them remove this tree from the National Register of Trees? So it makes you think not just about the trees but also about yourself, and maybe look inward and reflect on our own respect and compassion for other people and other beings. So just wanted to add these points, and that's something that I've tried to grapple as a writer, how to bring these other dimensions about trees when you write about them. So.
That's lovely, and I think one of the chapters for us, which was hardest to write in Cities and Canopies, was the chapter on looking at exotics and native trees. There's so much rhetoric today about planting native species in cities. And while we have some sympathy for that, because certain kinds of species, for instance, planting eucalyptus and acacia, which are water guzzling across, certain kinds of species of Acacia auriculiformis, for instance, which guzzle a lot of water across Indian landscapes, is definitely not the best thing to do. But a lot of our ideas about what is native and exotic comes from this bias about what is local, who is an outsider, and then all of these discussions in Bangalore about being outsider or insider. And so looking at the ecological issues and separating from the social becomes surprisingly very difficult when you're actually trying to write a chapter, and you realize how much bias creeps in. You also realize, I think, one thing and that leads me to a question I'm going to ask both of you. What was the most surprising thing that you found when writing the book? I think for me, one of the most surprising things was the little we know about our own country. What kind of basic ecologies are there in our country? For instance, we were writing a chapter on how trees communicate, something that you just spoke of, Sridhar. And there's so much of discovery and research now about the wood wide web, that is this underground network of fungal mycelia, which trees of the same species and of different species use to communicate through an underground network, where they're supplying each other not just with information and warnings of pest attacks, etc., but also with food. So a tree of one species will support a tree of another species with food. And we know all of this happens in temperate landscapes. Does it happen in tropical landscapes? We know very little. And even more, for me, because I'm always interested in the city angle, what happens when you pour cement over an entire road? What happens to the fungal mycelia, and do these trees stop talking to each other? And is that the reason why we see so much tree fall? It's not too difficult to do this research, but it's just that nobody's done it. And so just that whole lack, the fact that the universe of knowledge is so huge, but our component of it is so tiny, that's something that surprised me. So maybe what was the most surprising thing for you?
Yeah, for me, I think one thing that I found very surprising is that very often people disconnect themselves from nature. They imagine nature as something that is out there rather than as something that's around us, and that we are a part of nature. And I don't know where this really comes from, because if you want to appreciate trees, they are in cities, they are in the countryside, the beautiful banyan trees and the tamarind trees that you see in the villages, or even in the forests, which have these hundreds of tree species. And this nature versus culture dichotomy, I don't know if it always existed. There is this beautiful poem written by Avayar in the Tamil Sangam literature. There's a translation by A.K. Ramanujan. I won't read it out now, but you can look it up in his book, Poems of Love and War, where he actually talks about the bombax tree. And you will see that if you read that poem, you see that there is no separation really between nature and culture. There was a time when we saw ourselves as part of nature and that we were intricately connected with trees. And I feel that we have lost some of that in recent times. So when we see trees disappear, we feel powerless because we have lost that connect and we don't feel empowered to go and try and do something about it. So that was a surprising aspect, and it was also a challenge as a writer to see how we can break that, that barrier and break that disconnect as far as possible.
I think that's lovely, and I'd like to take actually some audience questions on that. But before that, I know Nirupa has a number of lovely images. I wanted to know if you could just show us a few more of these.
Okay, let me see. This one is actually on the gular, Ficus racemosa. And I actually found this in the Indira Gandhi, that park which is just here on Palace Road. Yeah, so, and speaking of what Sridhar said, I think this is so, fig species are so important to an ecosystem because a lot of birds and animals rely on figs even in lean times when other trees are not in season. So you kind of cut down a fig tree and you remove that keystone from the ecosystem. There's so many other things that there's a sort of butterfly effect. And this is the cover page of the book. I mean, this is the flower that's on the cover page. And it's called the Elephant Foot Yam. The tuber of this yam is actually eaten in villages across the country, but the flower is also super interesting because it actually is pollinated by beetles that like to lay their eggs in dead and rotting matter. So in order to attract these pollinators, they kind of, they play a little deception game where they emit the stench of rotting flesh. And the beetles will realize this deception and they'll move on, but the flower's work is done, it'll carry the pollen along with it. And then there's the Neela Kurinji, which everyone knows blossoms once every 12 years in order to attract pollinators like the bumblebee. It's a sort of pollinating mechanism. I mean, it's a strategy where they invest all of their resources in this one mass flowering event, and then they all die out after that.
Great. So thanks for that. These are incredible pictures. I think you should just look at them and they give you a certain sense of the magic of these landscapes. So with that, we have 2 minutes left. So unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but we will be around for Q&A. And if you want any books signed or you want to pick up the books, we'd be happy to do that for you at Atakalata. I'll just ask if there are any closing things that Sridhar wants to say or Nirupa.
I'm fine. I'm very happy to chat with you about trees.
Yes.
After this session. Yeah.
And I think we'd all really like to know from you. If you're here, I'm assuming you're interested in nature writing. So what's the kind of nature writing that you read? What's the kind of nature writing that you'd like to read? Because there's so much resurgence of nature writing in India these days. So that's something I think I'd at least love to chat with people. Nirupa?
I think Sridhar and Harini will both attest to the fact that when it comes to plants, the more you learn about them, the more you can't help but love them. So cheers to that. Let's rediscover this kingdom that's hidden in plain sight.